It gives me such great pleasure to introduce all of you to Jonathan Colbert. Jonathan is a great and longtime friend of Cliff and mine from spending time together raising our kids. We owned a property together in Santa Barbara and had 8 kids collected on that one property. We had some marvelous and wild times and lots of great potlucks and discussions. And he's somebody who has given a lot of thought to this topic of right livelihood. Maybe a subtitle would be Finding Our Calling. He is a longtime theosophist. He was born into a theosophical family, and his father led a theosophical group in Julian, California, where Jonathan is now. And he's sort of stepped into his father's footsteps, I think I can say. After Jonathan has a chance to just give us some thoughts on this topic of right livelihood, which actually comes from the Buddhist tradition of the Eightfold Path, we will have a chance to open it up for general conversation. I'm so sure that each of you has life experiences that give you insight into this topic of right livelihood. Jonathan, it's so wonderful to have you.
Oh, wow. Thanks for that wonderful welcome. Aloha, everyone. And I'm very happy to be with you. It's quite an honor. I would say that if I have found any kind of right livelihood at all, that the person that I would be the most indebted to would be actually Cliff Tillotson. And he's the one that got me going with landscaping and erosion control, which is what I do now. And right now I've kind of drifted more into the erosion control side of things, which has to do with soil stabilization all over California. Our main job is to make it look like that nobody was ever there. And the biggest compliment is when somebody asks me, oh, really, where did you work? And I'll tell them, well, we did a bridge on the 101 or the 5 freeway or something like that. And they go by there and they can't see that anything happened. And that's what I say is exactly. So basically, right livelihood as finding your calling, I think that kind of an emphasis tries to point to some of the nuances of right livelihood. I think that many times when people are studying the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, they kind of brush over right livelihood because they'll see something that says, no killing, just, obvious things not to do. And people think, okay, fine, let's go to the next one, right? But in terms of finding your calling, that is something very much deeper. And I'm sure that all of you are very much involved with that. I mean, anybody who would be associated with the Tillotsons would be people, I would think, that would be living a life of self-examination, of sifting, of traveling some kind of a path, I would think, and trying to release their very best, the very best that they know that they have to offer. Now, in the context of Buddhism, people sometimes ask me what religion I am, and then they'll even come into my house and they'll see a big Buddha or something like that above the fireplace and things like that. And so they think, oh, you're a Buddhist, and I don't deny it. So I don't, I guess it's my favorite religion, but I was kind of trained and taught since I was very little to try and think universally. But I just love Buddhism, just the ethics, the purity of it, and the helpfulness that it has to offer. Because first of all, the Four Noble Truths, for example, they almost look at life certainly very existentially from the point of view of where we actually are. but also therapeutically. And so that's where it gets really interesting to me, because it has to do with wisdom and practice, the therapeutics of applying great ideas into one's everyday life, and in terms of relieving suffering specifically. And the Four Noble Truths, you could say, could be looked at in terms of disease and the cure for disease. And the first one is dukkha. And I would say that it is a diagnostic truth. What is it diagnosing? It's diagnosing the problem. What is the problem? The fundamental problem is suffering. There's so much suffering in the world. Now, this is not to say that it's a negative worldview, really. Rather, it's a pragmatic perspective that deals with the actual physical and mental suffering that humanity faces. And now the second one, the second noble truth, is samadaya. And I would call that having to do with epidemiology. Robert can help me say that word. Or epidemiological, which has to do with what is the cause of suffering? What is the cause of the disease? And that's what epidemiology seeks to find out. And samadaya literally means the origin or the arising of something. So what is the origin of all the suffering? Well, in Buddhism, it talks about that. And it says that it's really desire and ignorance that lie at the root of suffering. And by desire, Buddhists refer to really craving. Craving of what? Craving of wants that can never be satisfied, such as pleasure. There's the ever receding goal of pleasure. I want pleasure, but when you get there, then you want more, etc., etc. Same thing with material things. There is such things as wanting and having and getting material things. But at the level of craving, enough is never enough. And finally, there is this thing as the craving of one's own, of the immortality of one's own separative ego. And in Buddhism, there really actually is no separative ego, and much less is there any kind of actual immortality for such a thing. So my persona isn't going to last forever. It's fleeting. It's not final. It's not ultimate. And now the third noble truth is, I would call it prognostic. What's the prognosis? Because so far there's suffering, and then there's this cause of suffering, which seems to be so ubiquitous. So it seems almost hopeless. But the third one, the prognosis, is actually quite good. It's called nirodha, and it's called cessation or ending. And it's an affirmation that there is actually an end to the suffering. And you can look at it in two ways. There's either an end to the suffering in this life on earth, so happiness can actually be achieved, or in another perspective, there's an end through achieving nirvana, which is something that Buddhism promises the possibility of. Finally, in this kind of medical analysis here of the Four Noble Truths, the last one I would say is prescriptive. It tells you what to do. And it's called magga, which literally means a path. And it charts a way, it charts a path for attaining the end of suffering. And that path actually has 8 aspects, and it's called the Noble Eightfold Path. And right living happens to be the 5th on the Eightfold Path. And the first is right understanding, the second is right thought, and then you have right speech, right action, right livelihood. And the last 3 are right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, 3 of these ones right speech, right action, and right livelihood, I would say, have the most specific to do with practicing Buddhism in a moral context. All 8 of them obviously are practicing and Buddhism and living the life. The 3 most moral in terms of one's moral conduct, I guess one would say, would be right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So I'm going to read to you a couple of precepts from the Dhammapada, which is, I guess, the most famous of all the Buddhist texts. One sentence says, "He who quotes sacred texts but is lazy and will not apply, he is like a cowherd counting the cows of others. He shares not the blessings of the good life." In other words, there's something fundamentally not healthy about calling yourself a herder of cows, but all you do is you go around counting the herds and the cows of other people. I mean, it's like a fundamental abdication of duty, I guess. So, in other words, this sentence seems to be saying that if you're going to try to understand and even quote from sacred texts, it's not a lazy life. It has to do with getting out there and applying these ideas. And this is something that I think I also learned very much from Cliff and Renee, for sure. These guys are the most energetic people you'll ever meet, as you know. Now, here's another one. You have to listen carefully to this one. It says, it has to do with discipline and self-discipline and what wise people do. So it says, irrigators lead the waters. Fletchers shape the arrows. Carpenters carve the wood. Wise people discipline themselves. So if somebody is going to be doing irrigation and leading the waters, there's a lot of experience and care that goes into that. Or if somebody is going to be a fletcher of arrows, there's a lot of skill and knowledge, and there's a lot of discipline that would go into that. Carpenters carving the wood, that's not just a haphazard thing. Not everybody can even do it. Just so wise people discipline themselves. So these are, I just selected these 2 sentences talking about the idea of these 3 ideas of right speech, right action, right livelihood. Is really the idea of moral conduct and really walking the talk. And so now, as to get started, I think that in popular Buddhism, there is the idea of the 5 Buddhist precepts. And these 5 are don'ts. Don't do X, Y, and Z. So it's what we all hear about when we hear about right livelihood. Not killing, not stealing, not misusing sex, not lying, not abusing intoxicants. So it seems to be a fundamental check that if you're trying to live some kind of a path of learning or a spiritual life, the fundamental basics are laid out there. And these all have to do with, I think, the fundamental idea in Buddhism that all life is sentient. And it's the basics, it's the building blocks of compassion, really. That if you hear the Dalai Lama or anyone who is speaking in an inspiring way about Buddhist precepts, is that we want to look at all life as important. Nothing is dead. Certainly nothing in nature is dead, but nothing is dead. Not even a piece of paper, not even the computer. there's all kinds of life everywhere, and it may be invisible, but everything is alive. And for example, I have a Buddhist friend who was talking about his vegetarianism, and he says, I'm just not going to eat anything with a face. Well, that sounds kind of crude and so forth, but to me, that said a lot, because what is something with a face? It's something that's alive, that has feelings, that's sentient life, and it's here for a reason. And it's not here just randomly, and it's not for our abuse, etc. It's the same way with not stealing. Well, somebody got what they had from hard work. And in other words, it's really the golden rule. These 5 things are really, how would you like if somebody stole from you, for example? Not using sex, that's pointing to the sacredness of the human body. That everything is alive and everything is part of the whole. Not lying, and that specifically has to do with right speech. But it has to do with not treating people as a means, but instead as an end, and not abusing intoxicants, because this has to do with delusion. And the fundamental idea of Buddhism is to try to see things clearly. So one could go on about these, but I wanted to just go into something about 2 different kinds of so-called wrong livelihood, and then ask why these 2 different kinds are different, perhaps, and then go into what might be right livelihood and the idea of finding one's Swadharma, really, so to speak. So I came across something in Buddhism, and it was called wrong livelihood for lay followers. And then there's another thing that says wrong livelihood for contemplatives. And I wanted to go into the difference between those 2 things. So the wrong livelihood for lay followers has to do with those 5 precepts, those 5 don'ts. So therefore, if one really adhered to those 5 precepts, one would not do business in weapons. One would probably not be an arms manufacturer, for example. Perhaps one probably would not own a gun shop. I wouldn't think so. I don't think I've ever met a Buddhist who had a gun shop. Here's one. One would not do business in human beings. I don't know exactly what that is, but it certainly would, exclude anything that used another human being as a means instead of an end in and of themselves. One would not do business in meat. One would not do business in intoxicants. One would not do business in poison. That's an interesting one. But it's basically saying that one would try to live in such a way that is in harmony with one's environment. Business and poison might include nowadays pollution, carbon footprint, all kinds of poison. It could even be having to do with poisonous speech. So there's these are things that could be really explored, I would think. Now, I wanted to read these interesting 7 things that I came across. There's actually about 12, but I whittled it down to 7, of wrong livelihood for contemplatives, because the ones for lay people are obvious, it seems. And that's the hazard of brushing past this part of the Eightfold Path. But here's something more subtle, because I would think that anyone who is really into Buddhism, yes, they would be a lay person, but there's something about just dabbling in Buddhism, that kind of releases secret resolves within oneself. One starts to make promises that one may not even know about. But there's something that starts to happen, especially for somebody who wakes up to this Eightfold Path. Here's one. A contemplative would not read the mark as a method of livelihood. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't do these things, but as a method of livelihood, in other words, taking money for these things, apparently a contemplative would not do this. And I'm also thinking that's somebody who is like a monk, who is like a monastic. But nowadays, the idea of what is and what is not a monastic is very gray area. And there's such thing as secular monasticism. And there are people who really try to live their life, but they don't live in a special place with other monks. So for money, a monastic or a contemplative would not read marks on the limbs. And then it says in parentheses, palmistry. So apparently they wouldn't do palm reading for money. They wouldn't do things like reading omens and signs for money, interpreting celestial events, etc. It says here, falling stars and comets, interpreting dreams, offering blood sacrifices, etc., reciting house protection charms, snake charming, kind of a throwback to certain kinds of antiquity here. But I don't know why these things are specifically for so-called contemplatives, other than that the idea that the contemplative is a person trying to separate the spiritual from the psychic, and they're trying to sift through what's real and what's unreal. And there are people who are on the spiritual path that find psychic powers just awakening in themselves, and they didn't even try. And to start monetizing these things seems like it's being warned against. So it's not that one wouldn't do these things in terms of helping one's neighbor and so forth, or giving somebody a warning that they had a dream or something like that. But I think it's the connection of money and the reward aspect of money, diluting and clouding the difference between the psychic and what's truly spiritual, must have something to do with it. But maybe we can figure that out in our conversation. Now, all of this has to do with the word perfect, I think. In other words, and the word right. What do these things mean? My understanding that right livelihood, the way they really say it in the Pali language, is sama ajiva. And sama means complete and perfected more than it means simply right. So it's really complete livelihood or perfected. And I think that the perfected is more in terms of a ripening. So like a fruit is perfect when it becomes ripe, when it becomes mature, that kind of a thing. So instead of simply right and wrong or exactly correct and all these things, we think that it has to do with a completion and finding a sweet spot, you could say. So therefore, sama ajiva could mean something more like livelihood fully understood and rightly conducted. See, that's a little more nuanced. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, in chapter 3, verse 35, there's a sentence that talks about doing one's duty. And it says that better is one's own duty, though imperfectly done, than the duty of another well done. So it has to do with that authenticity of who you are. Better is death in doing one's own duty, the Swadharma. The duty of another brings danger. So this thing about right livelihood and finding it for oneself is something intimately personal, I would say. Intimately something that one has to discover for oneself. There is a sentence from Vinoba Bhave that I know that a lot of the people here have admired. And he was a follower of Gandhi, and he was a deep student of the Gita. And he said that the seeker after perfection, and he calls that person a sadhaka, the seeker, needs to leave the crooked ways of adharma. So adharma is like ignorance. It's like living outside the laws of nature, outside the laws of harmony. Needs to leave the crooked ways of adharma and paradharma and take the natural, easy path of swadharma. And the paradharma, from my understanding, that's when you start doing the duty of another person and you start getting mixed up in somebody else's path. That's paradharma. And Vinoba Bhavi is calling these the crooked ways. And then he says, and those are the hard ways anyway. It's hard to do. It's an uphill deal, doing adharma and paradharma. The easy path, the natural easy path, is the path of swadharma. And what is swadharma? I am going to share the screen if I could. And I am going to do this and do this. I had my daughter make this little Venn diagram for me. Okay. So this is what I've been telling my kids for a long time. And I think that this is some kind of a clue as to what finding one's real duty in life, one's real role, one's real place, one's real contribution, you could say. So according to my theory, that you can imagine a Venn diagram with 3 circles, and that one swadharma is the interaction of the 3 circles, that sweet spot. A person, it's good for a person who wants to be in harmony with nature and with life to think that there's such thing as the universal good. And that quote that Renee read from indicated as such. And that right livelihood is indicating that one can actually make a contribution to the whole world, even if it's very, very modest. And then it seems that another thing that one wants to be authentically honest about with oneself is to do what you're good at. You know, there's a reason why you are good at what you're good at. God made you that way. A Buddhist might say that's your karma from previous lives. They might even say that your strengths are the evidence of vows that you have taken in previous lives, and that they show up in this life as your strengths. And also, there's a third circle, which is simply what you enjoy. You don't want to do something that you don't like to do. And it seems like that, and you can see why nobody else can tell you what your swadharma is, and why you wouldn't even, from this perspective, or why it wouldn't even occur to you to try and follow somebody else's swadharma, because it's something that is so inherently you, and that only something that you can realize and to bring into practice. So Renee told me to keep this at 10 minutes. I think I talked longer than that. I'm going to stop sharing. And that's my thing. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was amazingly clear and helpful talk. There may be concepts or names of concepts that people want to follow through and ask you about. For myself, I was just about to say, after we've had this beautiful, beautiful summary of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, which end in the Eightfold Path, of which this is one of those three aspects of the Eightfold Path that most allow us to act in moral ways through our speech, our actions, and the livelihood that we choose. All that's great, but okay, tell me how I figure out what my livelihood is, which it took me until I was 54 years old to actually figure out, by the way. So there's always hope, I suppose. And then you gave us that beautiful diagram at the end, which was really helpful. So I would love to, at this point, throw it open to the rest of our group. And if I haven't greeted you yet today, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad to have each of you here.
Renee. And
Ramdas.
hi. Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. Jonathan, you talked about the difference between Swadharma of the contemplative. And so I think what's important is to understand that the main reason, the main difference between a contemplative and a householder is that a contemplative, their primary life, their primary existence is personal realization, personal accomplishment, personal perfection. And in fact, you mentioned about completeness. The Sanskrit word purana means both complete and perfect, because when you are complete, you're perfect. And so the householder, very important part of the householder's life is to take care of the family and to work in the world and to make the world a better place. But for the contemplative, it's individual perfection in a way that facilitates for you an opportunity to then teach others that same thing. And all the things that you mentioned, palmistry, astrology, and that, the reason that they are not to get money for that is because those are spiritual things. Those deal with the spirit realm. And you can be a contemplative and you can have a cow and you can have milk and you can sell the milk. But that's not seen at all as a problem. And there are monasteries where that happens, right? But when you get into the spirit stuff, no, you don't sell that. And we're talking about Tantra too, because when you talk about healing, you're talking about Tantra. And contemplatives do those things, but you should never do it. I was always taught, and I was a monk for many years, I was always taught that those things you never charge for. It's just not, it changes your karma very much. Those you do for the benefit of others. And that's it. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, yeah. No, could I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure, please.
Would you say that that's kind of mixing of the householder with the contemplative in kind of a wrong way? In other words, you're turning, because the householder, you really have to do transactional things. Mm-hmm. You know, Cliff and I are contractors, for example. You know, you promise that you're going to do something and you do it, and you agree on a price and so forth, and you do that. And that has to do with, like you say, supporting the family or supporting the community, so forth. Yeah. But the transactional, there's no place for the transactional in what you're describing in the monastic life.
For the monastic, anything that you do that simply benefits the physical realm, and benefiting the physical realm is an important part of of life. Right, and in the Hindu tradition, there are the four fruits in life, and artha, which is wealth and meaning, and having enough food to eat, and all of those things. That's important. So a householder can do that in a dharmic way, and I think the way you talked about dharma is very good, and especially Swadharma. I thought your diagram there was really great. So thank you for that. But as a monastic or as a contemplative, what you should not do is those things that really take you into the spirit realm as a profession that you charge for, because then it takes away the meaning. It's the difference between love and prostitution.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Right.
Does that make sense?
I learned a lot. I appreciate that.
Jonathan, I have a question.
Yes.
So our society, or our economic society, is one of capitalism, which doesn't seem very conducive to the idea of right livelihood because it's based on competition, pitting oneself against another for the most part, and the whole idea that everything is kind of zero sum.
Yep.
Whereas in my experiences over the years that you and I shared together working as well as on my own now, I've always found it much more enjoyable when you can come up with a win-win situation rather than, I get all the chips, and your diagram there about doing something you enjoy. I always enjoy in contracting trying to come up with win-win solutions. And I was wondering if going back to the first step on the Eightfold Path about right views or whatever, I'm wondering if taking the view that the universe is one of plenty rather than one of scarcity and limitation would help one to, more find right livelihood and one's right livelihood. I'm wondering, like with your diagram with the three circles intersecting, I'm wondering if you could draw a circle around all three of those, which would be like, a universe of plenty. Because if you really live in a universe of plenty, then you can give, you have the notion of giving more, which is enjoyable, and so forth. So I just was wondering if that whole idea of a universe of plenty can be helpful in trying to find one's right livelihood.
Yeah, that's, in one way you've answered your question very, very eloquently, but I'll just try and say a few things that hopefully can be worthy of following up with that. Is in a universe of plenty, you don't have to worry about anything. A nice, quick physical way of realizing that there's plenty is just to go to the ocean, any place in Hawaii, and there's just plenty. Or at night, you go to a mountaintop and you can see the stars, and if you go high enough. And there's just plenty. There's no shortage. And that kind of thinking where there's just a plenitude of spiritual resources, you could say, and psychological resources and friendship. There's plenty of friendship. There's plenty for everybody. Sometimes just as I get older, I start joking that I'm almost the stupidest business guy I've ever met, because I find myself negotiating up negotiating up for somebody else on their behalf instead of down. I'm just thinking, what kind of a business guy is that? How come I've been doing this for, 33 years or whatever? And I'm saying, no, you're not getting enough. I think that you need more, and stuff like that. But it's just because there's such thing as a win-win. And you could say, well, there's a pragmatism to that because you want to keep the relationship and all that stuff. But really, no, I think it comes from something much more richer, much more wealthy in terms of an inner wealth. Not that I have it, but I'm just trying to affirm that there's such a thing as that. What else did you kind of get me to think about in that whole thing? That's kind of it, that, yeah. And it also in terms of being in business, I know what occurred to me is more and more when estimating and choosing which jobs to estimate, I'm starting to ask myself, instead of the strategy thing, because people love strategy, right? And how can you beat the other guy? And okay, where's their location? And what are their advantages and disadvantages, right? There's that whole thing. But I'm starting to be more and more like, why am I the guy really to do this job? What do I really actually have to offer? And if I start thinking that other people are actually better qualified to do this job, first of all, the practical reality that I'm not going to get it is there, but also just the philosophical reality that, wait a minute, maybe each person in each company and so forth is meant to do something. And if I feel like that, okay, I really do have something to offer here just because of a certain level of experience or whatever, then I'll put my price out there, but I'm not so worried if I get the job because somehow it's all going to work itself out. So I don't know if anybody else has anything else to offer with that.
David, did you have something you were going to add?
It is the season of Burning Man, and you just reminded me this notion about giving, because Burning Man was founded on the idea of a giving economy. Nothing there is for sale. And you can see by the success of it and just the amazing things that have come out of that, how well that actually works. So thank you for that.
Oh, very kind. Yeah, one wonders almost in some kind of a future economics. I was thinking about it. I haven't quite put together this idea, so you're going to get a half-baked idea from me right now. But I was wondering if the real currency of economics is not the dollar, it's not gold, it's not cryptocurrency or anything like that. It's gratitude, because it's like the fundamental thing that, in terms of a real transaction, that it's the real part of any transaction is what I'm trying to say. If you're trying to sift through the meaning of anything, it's what component or what quotient of gratitude was present. And even at the grocery store, we say, thank you, or thank you, have a nice day. And everybody says that, in any kind of a economic transaction. And I was wondering if that's almost like the fundamental baseline currency that all these other currencies are kind of more shadows of, but I haven't really developed that idea any further than that.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
I teach a class in ethics, and one of the issues that we deal with are animal rights. And you know how a person, well, when you do something for somebody and they appreciate it, that's a high for you, right? You go, wow, that was awesome that I was able to accomplish this. And the sense of accomplishment, if you have an interior life, your sense of accomplishment is as valuable as the money that you get. Well, they found that cows also have that same sense of accomplishment. And they've taken cows and they put like a hat on the cows like they do with people to look at the various areas of the brain and what areas of the brain are activated. And then they'll put cows in a pen and let them try to figure out how to get out. And when the cow figures out how to open the gate, they get the same high. So their accomplishment is obviously on a very physical level. Our accomplishments, for those of us who have an interior life, is on a spiritual level. So even though we're accomplishing physical things, we realize that there's a spiritual reality to what we have just done. And that is, I think, is what you're talking about.
That's very helpful. Not to bring the conversation too low, but you ever seen a chicken after they laid an egg? They're pretty happy.
Awesome. Well, that's a mother.
I think Robert has his hand up.
Yes.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was trying to figure out how you address a single portion of the Eightfold Path, because it seems like in a way each one is like a spoke of a wheel, the wheel of Dharma. Mm-hmm. So you can focus on a particular spoke, but if all the spokes aren't there, that wheel will collapse. So I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, in a lot of spiritual traditions, you get numbered things, the 7 of these and the 5 of those, etc. And this is the 8 of something, right? And in a lot of these numbered systems, many of them are sequential. Some of them are spiral-like, and you come back around to where you were the first time, but at a higher level. But my understanding, humble understanding of the Eightfold Path is that they are all simultaneous. But some, you can kind of categorize them, that the right speech, right action, right livelihood are moral conduct. They're all practice. Meditation, right view, right concentration. Can't remember them all, but they're all practice for sure. So in other words, what is concentration? It's something you practice, etc. What is philosophy? It's something you practice. Everything, these are all practices, but these three specifically are moral. It's like, it's what you do. It's what you do matters, and so forth. Because I think that's fundamental, because we're not disconnected from the whole. The idea of us being separate is just it's a temporary illusion. There's just no, there's no reality to separateness. And so that's, I think that's why the moral conduct is so immediately important. But maybe people can can kind of make connections between these. Cliff already made that connection between right view and talking about plenty in relationship to right livelihood, and how it actually makes you happier. So in other words, to have your philosophical grounding, as you choose what to do, and as you try to exemplify moral conduct, it makes you happier. It happens to be a wonderful byproduct. Are there anybody else that has anything that, because I think that you could just write books and books and books about how each one relates to the other seven, for sure. And they all magnify each other, and they all enhance each other.
Jonathan,
Yes.
I feel as if both your suggestion of this sense of gratitude and Ram Dass's matching suggestion of the feeling of accomplishment that is common not only to us in the human world, in the animal kingdom as well, might be one of those things that could serve to help people who are seeking their right livelihood to know, oh, I'm getting hotter, I'm hotter, no, colder, hotter. Like, this is really rewarding, this feels good. Okay, that's probably a good indicator that we're getting closer.
It's a clue, I would think so, yeah. But it would also seem, because a lot of people are, like in this group here, are, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. Supposedly they're already doing their career, or these days everything is so accelerated. The karma of everything is so accelerated. A lot of people are saying, I think I've lived like 3 or 4 lives already, and they're only like 42 or something. But my point here being that even if one is engaged in a given course of action, or in a given livelihood, one could say, one wonders if these three, because there's nuances, and there's deeper variations of one's career, you could say. There's and one could make, and I would think that the subtle adjustments is where the real action is, because it's one thing to totally upend one's life and to just completely do something else. Just change who their partner is, change who they're married to, just move to a whole different place or whatever. I was a teacher, now I'm this. Now I'm firefighter. But isn't the real interesting zone in the subtle adjustments? And I would think obviously this would pertain to somebody who's in their teens or in their 20s. What do I want to do? That was Arjuna's fundamental question in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna, tell me what to do. I just want to know what to do. But also in the subtle adjustments about whether one is going to do something that's very difficult. A person, I think recently there was the celebration of Ganesh Chaturthi. And my humble understanding of Ganesh is he's the remover of obstacles. And sometimes we encounter things in life that we know are daunting and that we know are going to be difficult. But it seems that the little diagram, the Venn diagram, could be helpful in unlocking the mystery of certain situations and discerning one's duty and, what one's road that one's going to take.
Thank you. Aloha, everybody. So I've been starting homeschooling my daughter, and one of the first texts that we're using is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And one thing that my daughters really kind of like to find out about him is that at one point he proposed that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be matched by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. That meaning and responsibility, work hand in hand. And in his experience, in his personal and clinical experience, is what really brought him through. So I really appreciate what you say about the, about that sense of accomplishment, that can be, a fulfillment and a reward or a currency. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, Viktor Frankl was, there's people here who can tell more about him than I could, but he was a survivor of the Nazi death camps. And somehow I'm linking that in with what Cliff was saying about the idea that there's plenty, because in a dire, dark situation like where there's death and all this stuff, you would think that there's just scarcity. There's just no options and so forth. But he was almost like Epictetus, where he said, okay, maybe there's the limitations of what's going on, dire limitations, but nobody can control how I think. And I can discern meaning in this situation. So therefore, in that way, I'm free. And I can take responsibility for my thoughts. And maybe that's the connection with the idea of the statue of responsibility. That's just amazing. What kind of a statue are we going to put in Hawaii that goes along with this?
I think those comments are also helpful in relation to so many folks who find themselves in a given role in terms of livelihood that are in which many aspects are very disagreeable. I mean, I can give you many examples. I'm sure we all have many examples. It's a boss who's awful or verbally abusive, or some given task that is very demeaning, or you're being asked to do things that are morally questionable, and things like that. And that I think of my father especially, who, the last 40 years of his life, he was in a job that he hated. He absolutely hated, but he was raising 4 kids, and he had a mortgage and 2 cars. And there wasn't really an option that he could see for getting out of the situation he was in, and so he stuck with it. And so I think that all those comments about the subtle shifts that one can make within a given context, no matter how limiting it may seem, that change one's perspective in relation to the livelihood that maybe can't be changed at the moment, can't be shifted. That one's outlook on it, outlook on other people, outlook on the inner richness, the sort of hidden golden aspects of it that are not so evident on the surface. I think those very helpful comments. Thank you.
And I think Kirk is really touching on the situation that a lot of people are in. It's one thing to imagine an ideal situation. It's another to it's almost more creative, more of a challenge to imagine making the best of a situation that one's in and realizing, wait a minute, I do have some initiative. I guess I could do this, you know, I guess I could look at it this way and so forth. To me, that's where the real nitty gritty, you know, comes in.
I'd like to add to,
and also I think, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, to add to that, it's not so much the what in terms of right livelihood, it's the how you go about it.
Can you explain that, Cliff?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Well, I mean, you may have a miserable job, you know, and all that, but you have so much freedom of creativity in how you approach everyone at a particular job, how you go about your day, like Viktor Frankl, how he conducted himself in a concentration camp. He didn't have control over the what, but he did have control over how he got up every morning and how he treated everybody.
Janine, it looked to me as if you were about to say something a little while ago. Do you still recall what you had in mind?
I was just motioning for David that I couldn't hear him.
Oh.
Yeah. Uh-huh. But I can. I mean, I have a few things I could add. I really appreciated when you were talking about Sama, about the different meanings of it, and you said something about, like, you know, like finding a sweet spot, or like a ripening. I think that is such an interesting idea, like a ripening. I mean, that there are these that we sometimes want things to happen like just right now, like we figured it out right now, but it can take a lot of time. So I think that's a really great thing to keep in mind. Something else that I'm thinking of in relation to what Cliff said, I've been reading this really interesting book called How to Do Nothing. And the writer of this book tells the story about her father, and how when her father was really young, he had this job that he just kind of hated it. He got sick of it. He saved up all his money so that for 2 years he could kind of take it easy, relax, go for walks, read, learn to play the flute. And so after 2 years, he looked around, he said, it's time for me to get a job again. Like, I'm looking for something new. But he actually realized that his old job was the perfect job and that he wanted to go back to his old job. So he went back and he asked for it. And the job hadn't changed, but he had changed during those 2 years when he kind of expanded his mind and learned to see things differently. So I think that kind of speaks to what Cliff was talking about this sort of what's happening in your mind, how you perceive things can really change. And actually he was able to make more of his job the second time around. It was a great story.
Yeah.
Wonderful story.
And it kind of, I think it goes also to what Robert, I think, was saying about how the other 7 spokes of the 8-spoked wheel are intimately connected, because a lot of them have to do with one's attitude and one's sense of responsibility. So, and also what was said about the time and the ripening. I remember one time Cliff was watching one of my kids paint a fence. And he was kind of fighting the whole situation. And Cliff says, poor X, I won't say his name, he thinks there's such thing as time. And I had to think about that one for a minute. He's under the illusion of time. But in other words, I think that, because isn't that a basic Buddhist idea, that there's really no such thing as time? Time's an illusion. Yet there is such thing as timing, isn't there? Just, basic, keeping appointments, doing what you say, etc. You wouldn't want to say that I don't need to keep the appointment that I made and do what I said I was going to do, because there's no such thing as time. There really is such thing as timing, and which has to do with ripeness. Timing is as natural and as beautiful and harmonious as just the unfoldment of a fruit. the ripening of a piece of fruit on, a fruit on a tree. And it does seem that all we have to do is wait till things ripen and they become perfect. I think somebody said that, really made the connection between perfection and ripening. And so it's kind of part of, it seems like it's part of the, one of the keys to wisdom, you could say, wisdom in action, practical application of metaphysics, really, because the idea that there's no such thing as time is quite metaphysical. But wisdom is when you can apply these ideas and be happy.
Jonathan, this was just really a very, very rich conversation that you initiated for us with so many wonderful ideas. I feel as if we could probably extend this for another hour and give so many people a chance to share from their own personal experience.
Yeah, for sure.
They have found in their own lives the truth of many of the things that were brought up so far today. I wonder whether there's anybody who would like to make a final comment and possibly give Jonathan a little vote of thanks.
I definitely want to thank Jonathan for speaking today. I think he brought up things that all of us need to think about on a regular basis, and it was and you presented it very nicely. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me learn from you guys.
It was really wonderful to have all of you tuning in, whether it was your bright, engaged eyes and smiles, or whether we actually got to hear from you. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for being so illuminating in your talk with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Aloha.